I'm rewatching Outlander from the beginning, and let's talk about Frank Randall, because book Frank and show Frank are two completely different people, and to be honest, it does change a lot. As always, this will have spoilers for the books and the TV show, so if you are looking to avoid those, please do keep on scrolling. So if you've already watched this show and are familiar with this man, Frank Randall, and have read the books, you will know that representation of Frank is at times vastly different in the show than he is portrayed in the books. And that is very true for the first episode of the show, titled Sassenach, where we meet Frank for the first time in Inverness on his second honeymoon of sorts with his wife Claire. I remember the first time I ever watched the show not really having an opinion, or a fully formed one, I should say, of Frank by the end of the episode. Other than that, something about his dynamic with Claire didn't jive that well for me. I thought, if these two are the people that I'm going to be watching for however many seasons, I don't know if I'm going to enjoy it quite as much as I think I should as a viewer. And to be fair, after reading the books, that's how it's meant to be portrayed. And in large part, Tobias Menzies changed the entire feel of the character because he's such a great actor. Now, in the show, Frank's portrayal is a little more sympathetic. There's a few reasons behind this, I believe, but also key plot points that add to this sympathy that we're supposed to feel. In the show version of events, Claire explains to the viewer that her marriage to Frank happened very quickly and in a hurry. It was sort of unplanned and decided upon in very short order. And as book readers and probably show watchers know, Claire is meant to be an unreliable narrator of this story. And so she justifies a lot of his selfishness at times by saying it's, due to his hardships during the war and him trying to deal with the aftermath of the war, which she is too. The two of them are meant to be going on their second honeymoon to rekindle their romance and get to know one another again. And Frank spends majority of this episode researching his family tree with the Reverend. I think Frank also visually is shown leading Claire in a lot of these scenes. I think their entire dynamic hinges upon him being the leader of the two of them. And of course, if you've already watched the show, you know that Claire likes to lead and her personality lends itself to that. In the books, Claire and Frank are actually married in the same church that Jamie and Claire are later married in. And I'll touch on that more when I get to the wedding episode. Frank also places a very large emphasis on having offspring, specifically a son. He, like the show, spends a majority of their honeymoon researching with the Reverend, but almost to the detriment of Claire. She's alone a lot of the times, and he doesn't seem to care about it that much. I'd argue in the books he spends more time with the Reverend than the show even portrays. To me, he comes across as more emotionally distant, at times a bit of an intellectual snob, which they do kind of brush upon in the show, but it's even more obvious in the books. And he's extremely focused on his career and historical research, rather than improving his marriage to Claire, which she believes they are up in the Highlands to do. But you can feel this sort of disconnect, almost like when you watch someone make a mistake over and over again and you're just like, you are starting to believe the lie. When you're reading Claire trying to make you like Frank, it feels a little bit like that. Claire's love for him just never feels passionate in the way that she describes it. It feels far more practical than emotional. And I do think that stems in large part from the fact that she was so young when they married, and then they spent the better part of 8 years of their marriage being separated because of the war. Now, I will say in the show, when Claire does go missing, Frank, you can tell, is deeply affected by this and does care for her deeply. He is worried sick about her. He spends a lot of time looking for her, but he is an angry person, I would argue, We can see that later on in the series as he continues looking for Claire. But our first impression of him in the show, I find to be far more sympathetic. And that's a theme that will carry through the rest of the series. And I think in season 3 is when we sort of get a little bit more insight into the not necessarily bad guy that Frank was, but he does some bad things. Now, of course, the show is trying to set us up for the end of the episode where we are introduced to Jamie and put Claire and Frank's relationship in direct contrast with her first interactions with Jamie. And they definitely achieve that in this episode, primarily through examples of Frank leading Claire, contrasted with Claire telling Jamie what to do and him being so willing to follow her, but also in how Frank feels like this safe, comfortable, familiar version of a relationship to Claire, and then this, spark that she feels with Jamie is the opposite of that. And that's on purpose to get us hooked into the show and wondering what's going on with this guy. And I think it's more effective in the show than in the books, because in the books, I was not really rooting for Frank at any point. So which Frank do you prefer? The cold but realistic book Frank or the more layered, sympathetic show Frank? Let me know in the comments.